Hello, I'm Niall Ferguson. I'm the Milbank Family Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and I'm also the chair of the Applied History Working Group. And we've been lucky today to hear a presentation from Professor Molly Worthen, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina and the author of this fascinating new book, Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. Molly, great to have you here at Hoover. Question, charisma. We use the word a lot, but you do a great job of explaining where it comes from and what its peculiar political significance is in the United States.
Charisma has two main meanings. One is the old meaning, the word charisma as Paul uses it in the New Testament to mean chosenness by God, a gift of grace by God. But the sociologist Max Weber took that word about 100 years ago and repurposed it in something much closer to the sense we use it today, to describe a kind of authority that is distinct from authority that comes from status in an institutional position or having access to a lot of military might, but is a relationship premised on followers believing in some kind of supernatural capacity in the leader. I came to focus on charisma as this deeply polarizing quality that is a relationship based on a leader's ability to invite followers into a transcendent story, a story that gives them a role, a sense of agency in their lives, and answers questions that the current stories on offer in the culture don't answer.
This is a very ambitious book. It goes all the way back to the period before the foundation of the Republic, and it comes up to the present. I get the sense that charisma ebbs and flows in American politics, that there are periods when charismatic leaders loom large, and then there are periods when they're somewhat marginalized. One of the points you made with us earlier on today had to do with that period after World War II, when, perhaps not surprisingly, there's a bit of a revulsion against charismatic leadership. Talk about that and talk about how that changes and when it changes.
Charisma and the rise of charismatic leaders always has a relationship to institutional crisis, for sure, and that's perhaps the ebbing and flowing that you refer to. The period right after World War II is this anomalous period because Americans generally, over the long durée of the country's history, have had a real suspicion of elites and experts. But in the course of World War II, charismatic leadership becomes so closely identified with Adolf Hitler. And there is this sense, both among the scholarly class and among journalists, that this is what charismatic leadership leads to. It leads to Holocaust, fascist terror, and if that's the case, it has no place in a modern pluralistic democracy. And we need to go 180 degrees in the other direction and place our faith in the story that expert technocrats tell. And so the period from 1945 into the late 1960s is a period when experts really did have something we could call charisma. They told a story that Americans bought into. And observers of American culture, especially in the academic class, they turn their attention to newly independent countries in the global south, in Africa, and they locate what I'll call the kind of old-fashioned notion of charisma there. They see it in rising new leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who I write about. But they think that their own culture has outgrown it, which was a mistake.
So talk a little bit about how things evolve in the 1970s, because in your book you give a sense that in the 1970s there's this kind of plethora of gurus, of charismatic leaders on the left, politically, and this seems to pave the way to a new era in American politics that begins to emerge in the 1980s. It's linked to religion and a change in the nature of American spirituality. But tell me a bit more about how that change happened.
One thing I'm trying to suggest in the book is that the stories of these religious leaders and movements that we might be tempted to think of as rather marginal and strange and distant from the experience of quote-unquote normal people actually tell us something very meaningful about the culture broadly construed, and they are perhaps exaggerated expressions of desires and anxieties that are much, much more common. In my coverage of the 1970s, I really went down a rabbit hole with the story of the Guru Maharaji and his organization, the Divine Light Mission. He's this 13-year-old chubby Indian kid who inherits a ministry from his father. And he comes to the United States in 1971, already with a fair amount of resources at his disposal. But the degree to which he is able to persuade frustrated middle-class suburban kids and disaffected student radicals to really pull out of the mainstream of life and move into ashrams and get a job at an organic grocery store and spend all of their savings going to gatherings where they might be able to kiss the lotus feet of their 13-year-old guru is really quite astonishing. I think there's a temptation to see it as weird and strange, but really it helps us see in clearer form a crisis of institutions that is, I think, more broadly captured by some of the poll data that we begin to see coming out of this period in which Americans are losing faith in the federal government, in later on the mainstream media and churches, and that opens them up to vulnerability, I think, to charismatic gurus.
So it begins with sort of cult-like phenomena of the sort you described. But then this thirst for self-actualization in the 1980s, it kind of goes mainstream and in some ways gets commercialized. Talk about that change and the kind of people that it produced.
The cult of self-actualization becomes almost the American state religion. I was fascinated by its development in the business world. There's this interesting turn that the world of management consulting takes in the early 1980s. In 1982, the former McKinsey consultant Tom Peters co-authors a book called In Search of Excellence, in which he really rejects what had been the dominating wisdom, which was a very quantitative approach to the success or failure of businesses. And he says that's all wrong. And in fact, it's made American companies way too risk-averse. And what's most important is the story you tell. The story you tell employees, the story you tell your customers, and whether you are meeting people's spiritual needs. This is quite explicit. I interviewed him, and he was totally horrified by the idea of being called a guru. But I do think that he's part of that broader trend, which then finds its way into leadership studies programs and the kind of broad world of pop psychology. Spent a lot of time writing about Tim Galway, who made his name as the author of the famous book, The Inner Game of Tennis. And he had been a disciple of the Guru Maharaji. And he takes this sort of ersatz version of kind of neo-Hindu, Buddhist, look into yourself, find enlightenment, but then applies it not just to skill in particular sports arenas, but into then the burgeoning world of executive coaching. And I think much of that language and that way of talking about our relationship to leaders filters into other cultural spheres as well.
So how do we get from that to the phenomenon of Donald Trump? He, in a sense, goes from being a marginal figure, a kind of huckster in New York real estate, through reality TV, into politics, and in this extraordinary 10-year period that we've lived through, becomes the dominant figure in American political life. You put him in your subtitle, so you have to explain to our listeners how he fits into your overall story.
Donald Trump is both a symptom of the age, but also an individual who has something that I think we need to recognize as a kind of genius in his ability to shape his own story and his own self-understanding to meet certain needs of a broad swath of Americans. He was telling a story about himself from his earliest appearances in the New York tabloids in the 1980s. It was one of being a kind of entrepreneur cowboy who is operating in a rigged system and is constantly fending off bad actors who would try to screw him over in various ways, and they would never be able to get away with it. He would always get revenge. And it's a story that translated in a fairly tidy way into the story that he came to tell in his national political campaign. As someone who was fighting this battle on behalf of the screwed over little guy who'd been left behind in globalization, in the progressive elite's turn toward catering toward a specific number of identity categories. But I think in Donald Trump's story, that is blended with his theological background. He grew up going to Marble Collegiate Church in New York City. hearing preaching at the feet of Norman Vincent Peale, the grandfather of Christian prosperity gospel. Really a metaphysical worldview in which you can conjure reality to meet your desires. And I think he was positioned to sense the potential for powerful alliances with a kind of underappreciated demographic among conservative Christians, and that's the independent, charismatic churches, who are quite global and complicated in their diversity, but are definitely a product of this anti-institutional age, untethered from the checks and balances that I think are required for humans to navigate successfully really quite scary ideas about demonic and supernatural power and the end times and these things. And I think Donald Trump, in his climb to a particular kind of an image of businessman authority through reality television, building on decades of a particular narrative about himself, was poised to take advantage of this unprecedented weakness in so many institutions across American life, from the Republican Party and its own establishment guardrails to the mainstream media.
Well, Molly, one of the great things about this book is that you take seriously the kind of aspirations, spiritual needs of ordinary people, and show the different ways in which, over time, they've been met. And I think anybody who reads Spellbound will have an entirely new view of Donald Trump, and indeed of American politics, by the time they've finished it. Thanks very much for coming and joining us here. The book, once again, is Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump, by Molly Worthen. I highly recommend it. You will think differently about American politics when you're done reading it. That's it from me. It's been a pleasure, Molly, to have you here. And I will only say, once again, thank you for tuning in to the Hoover Applied History Working Group.